Newly released autopsy results are raising more questions about how Nolan Wells died. An independent exam commissioned by his family's legal team classified the cause and manner of death for the 18-year-old as undetermined pending investigation.
He's saying based on the examination of the body, he cannot rule out foul play. That is significant.
The forensic pathologist wrote there were no fractures, cuts, or bruises on Nolan's body, but noted red discoloration was found on the back of his head and needs more investigation. The autopsy was performed 4 days after his body was found. The pathologist also writing there were missing parts of the neck.
Have you or he asked anyone for access to those things?
Hopefully that the medical examiner will allow him to come and examine the throat, also to talk about observations that they had, and so they could share information.
It is not unusual for a state medical examiner to keep parts for further evaluation. Former medical examiner Dr. Priya Banerjee reviewed the autopsy report.
I think the best thing we can take away is that there's no identifiable trauma.
The Jackson County Sheriff's Office is still investigating what happened after Nolan went to Horn Island in a boat with friends on July 4th. His body was found 2 days later washed ashore there. Today, the family's attorney noted the doctor was unable to examine the airways and lungs for water to determine drowning. In a recent interview, Warren Hudson says he'd been friends with Nolan since they were kids. Hudson said they frequently went boating, and they went to Horn Island with a large group of friends on July 4th.
Everybody's drinking, you know, I mean, it's 4th of July. Everyone's just trying to enjoy themselves.
Okay, Aaron Gilchrist joins us now. Aaron, the big question still remains here, and still no toxicology results?
Tom, the family's legal team is still waiting for the toxicology report from the state, and the medical examiner's office tells us today it will share appropriate information when the investigation is complete.
It's 11:47 p.m. on the 4th of July, and Christine Wansley's phone is ringing. It isn't her son's name on the screen. For 18 years, this is a call every mother on the Mississippi Gulf Coast prepares for without ever saying out loud. Not, he's had too much to drink. Not, the boat broke down. A different kind of call. The kind where the voice on the other end isn't the person you raise, it's one of his friends. And the first 4 words out his mouth are the ones that never leave you again. Have you heard from Nolan? She hadn't. Nobody had. Not since 3 o'clock that afternoon, when her son stood in ankle-deep water on a strip of federally protected sand 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, and told a girl he'd just met that he was heading back to the boat. He never made it. By the time the sun came up on July 5th, Nolan Xavier Wells, 18 years old, an honor-roll kind of kid without ever needing to be called one, a wide receiver who was supposed to report to preseason camp in 36 hours, was officially missing. By July 6th, he was found, face down, in the water, almost exactly where his friends say he was last seen alive. And that should have been the end of the story. A tragic accident on a holiday weekend. A rip current with a name locals use like a warning label. The washing machine. A search and rescue mission that, for once, actually recovered the person it was looking for. Instead, it became the beginning of one of the most contested, most scrutinized, most emotionally combustible missing person cases of the year. A case with 2 competing autopsies.
We are watching attorneys for Nolan Wells' family releasing the results of their independent autopsy report. 18-year-old Wells died after a July 4th boat trip with friends off the coast of Mississippi. His body was recovered on July 6th, and authorities say they believe he drowned and that there was no indication of a crime. But Wells' family says they have a lot of questions. And the family's attorney now says an independent autopsy found the cause and manner of death to be undetermined, pending more investigation. Let's bring in ABC News Chief Investigative Correspondent Aaron Katursky and legal contributor Brian Buckmeyer for more. So, Aaron, walk us through Ben Crump's arguments here. Why release these results if they're saying they don't have a result without more investigation?
Because he promised they would, and the family ordered it, and this is an expectation. They want to keep the case in the public eye. They want to add pressure to Mississippi authorities to conduct what they've called a fair and thorough investigation. And here, the independent autopsy does nothing at the moment, seemingly, to be at odds with the initial suspicion that Nolan Wells drowned off the coast of Mississippi. And as I think Ben Crump's comments reflect, the circumstances of what led him into the water are still unclear. This independent autopsy can't determine, and state investigators have not released their findings yet. But it's based on more than an autopsy. It's interviews with eyewitnesses and video and image analysis to try and understand what led Nolan Wells to go into the water and what were the circumstances that led to that. And those questions still have not been answered.
Brian, Crump is saying the reason this independent autopsy couldn't determine the manner and cause of death is because the state has not handed over enough to their expert in order to be able to do that. How much pressure does that now put on the state to release their autopsy results and also maybe give the family and this independent expert more to work with here?
How much, I think it might be hard to quantify, but it definitely increases the amount of pressure. Because I think while Ben Crump and his team are not providing us with answers in terms of what was the manner of death, what was the cause of death, it at least gives enough to say, okay, this is what's missing for us to be able to do the analysis. Because simply having a deceased person or a dead body doesn't give you all the answers. But I think what it does do is he's pinpointing, okay, the throat is a place we need to investigate. Okay, the manner in which his body was found, fully clothed, when we see videos of him without a shirt on, that is another point that we need to investigate to further our understanding of this. Because like any medical examiner, they're not just taking the individual's body, they're also taking the circumstances and the information they have surrounding the body to come up with a cause and manner of death. And Ben Crump, I think, is attempting to put pressure on the state and have other people kind of have this unsatisfactory feeling of we need to put pressure on the state so they can get those answers. I think that is part of the motivation here.
And yet, Diane and Brian, the independent autopsy revealed no fractures or deep tissue injuries. And so that does sort of suggest, even if it's not conclusive, that he wasn't beat up. He may not have been thrown overboard. I mean, there are things that this can rule out. There were no gunshot wounds. There were no stab wounds. There was no, it doesn't seem like a violent end, at least before he went into the water. So there's still a lot of questions and a lot of circumstances to understand, but the absence of fractures or deep tissue injuries does seem like a significant point.
But that's not including the throat, which is what Ben Crump is talking about. Yes, the occipital bone, which we can get Dr. Sutton here to do a better job of it, but we're talking about the back of the head here, which you typically talk about, like, did he fall on the boat and hit the back of his head and lose consciousness and that? Yes, absolutely rule that out, but I think what Ben Crump is attempting to do is, here's a piece that is important, the throat, that we don't know. And I don't know if that's going to win him the day, but at least he's trying to apply pressures, I think, the tactic there.
Yeah, and Crump's also not a doctor, but he's trying to explain this in layman's terms. Listen, you know, you're trying to say someone drowned, you need to be able to see if the body has water in it. You need to be able to see that person's throat. They've got this red mark on the back of the head. What does that mean? Aaron, how much of the state's autopsy is expected to answer some of these questions that Crump is now posing?
Not clear. You know, it depends on the findings, I suppose, and how much of it is going to be released. We rarely get detailed autopsy results. That's something that typically only the families of the decedent end up getting. We'll get a basic cause and manner of death, but the kinds of details that you get in this independent autopsy, apparently with the concession of the family, are rarely released in official autopsies, but they're still not finished with it. So we'll see, and we'll also see what the toxicology says about what may have been in Wells's system at the time.
A case where the FBI is now involved, not because anyone has been charged with anything, but because of threats serious enough to cross state lines. A case where a sitting judge, a forensic pathologist with 2 decades of experience, a civil rights attorney, the NAACP's national leadership, and a mother who still hasn't buried her grief along with her son are all, right now, asking versions of the exact same question. What actually happened to Nolan Wells in that 90-minute window nobody has ever been able to fully explain? This is not a story with a tidy ending. We're going to tell you that up front, because too much of what's been said about this case online has pretended otherwise. We're not going to pretend otherwise. What we're going to do is walk you through everything that is actually confirmed, everything that is still just a claim, and everywhere the two overlap in ways that should make anyone paying attention lean forward. Because somewhere between a boat, an island, and a phone that came home without him, there is a truth, and a family in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, is still waiting for someone to say it out loud. before the headlines, before the autopsy reports, before his name got attached to hashtags and reward funds and cable news panels arguing about blood pooling in soft tissue. There was just a kid from Ocean Springs who loved football, loved his family, and loved making sure nobody around him ever felt invisible. Nolan Xavier Wells was born and raised in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, a small coastal community across the bay from Biloxi, the kind of town where everybody's kids grow up playing the same Friday night football under the same lights. He was one of 6 children raised by Christine and Elmore Wansley, alongside his siblings Elmore, Ethan, Jalen, Jaden, and Carly. In a house that full, you learn early how to share attention, how to make room for other people, how to be loud enough to be heard, and generous enough to hand the spotlight back. Football wasn't a hobby in that household. It was close to a shared language. At Ocean Springs High School, Nolan was a multi-sport athlete, but it was football where he made his name, a 2-time all-region wide receiver. Over his junior and senior seasons alone, he caught 63 passes for 724 yards and 10 touchdowns. Those are the kind of numbers college scouts notice. They notice his, but ask the people who actually coach him, and the stats aren't the first thing they bring up. His head coach, Jake Bramlett, has said publicly that Nolan carried himself with humility, that he led by example rather than by volume, that the other players followed his actions more than they ever needed to follow his words. His principal, Dr. Jacob Dykes, remembered him the same way, one of the kindest, hardest-working students to come through that building, someone teachers and teammates gravitated toward without ever being asked to. Christine has told one particular story publicly more than once, because it seems to capture something essential about who her son actually was. In a math class, there was a special needs student in the room. When the teacher asked a question, before anyone else could jump in and answer for her, Nolan quietly got the whole class to put their hands down so she could answer on her own without feeling rushed or overshadowed. When she got it right, he led the celebration, not as a performance of the teacher, but because he meant it. That teacher emailed the family afterward, unprompted, just to tell them what she'd watched her son do. I always told Nolan, you have to be careful when you have a heart that big, Christine has said, because it's not always returned that way. But he was genuinely a good person. All the best parts of me are with him. Elmore has described his son as a silent leader. I really wanted to show, not tell, and people follow that. He said, he's talked about how Nolan's younger siblings looked up to him, and how much he'd been looking forward to watching his sons push each other that summer. After high school, Nolan enrolled at Southwest Mississippi Community College, roughly 2 hours inland from home, where he walked on as a freshman wide receiver, number 16, 6'1", 185 pounds, majoring in general business. He'd just finished his first year on campus. He was due back for summer training camp on Monday, July 6th, to start preparing for his first full season. That deadline matters more than it might sound like it should. It tells you exactly what this trip out to Horn Island was actually supposed to be, not an open-ended, anything-goes summer blowout, a short, ordinary break before the real work of the season started again. His coaches at Southwest have remembered him as a kid who made everyone around him feel accepted. Someone who, even after getting no playing time in a season opener, celebrated a team win like he'd scored the touchdown himself. Friends and family have described small, specific things about him that never make it into a headline, but that tell you more about a person than any statistic ever could. He was usually the one holding the phone up at gatherings, capturing everyone else having a good time, more often than he ever appeared in the frame himself. He'd send his father play-by-play breakdowns from practice, genuinely wanting the honest, unfiltered answer instead of the easy one. Because Elmore had told him early on that real support sometimes sounds like a hard truth instead of a compliment. His younger siblings had started measuring their own years against his, in the healthy way a younger brother does when he actually looks up to the person ahead of him instead of resenting him. None of that belongs in a police report, a GPS log, or an autopsy summary. All of it belongs here, because it's the reason this case was never simply a set of coordinates and timestamps to the people who actually knew him. That's who boarded a boat on the morning of the 4th of July, 2026. Independence Day fell on a Saturday that year. Nolan spent it away the same circle of friends that spent it before more than once, without incident. A boat trip out to Horn Island, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, federally protected land, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore. No roads, no buildings, no year-round law enforcement presence out there at all. Reachable only by private or charter boat. Known on an ordinary weekend for untouched white sand and total quiet. On a summer holiday, it is the opposite of quiet. Witness accounts describe hundreds, by some estimates thousands, of young people scattered along that stretch of beach that day. Boats lined up 3 rows deep off the island's western tip, stretching as far as anyone could see in either direction. It's the kind of scene that plays out on that same coastline every 4th of July, a tradition as regional as the tide itself. Nothing about the setup, on its face, was unusual. Nothing about it should have made the news at all. Before we go further into what actually happened on that island, we want to pause for just a second. If you're new to this channel, you should know something about how we work here. Every single case we cover, we build the same way. Confirm facts first. Disputed claims clearly labeled. Nothing stated as fact unless it's actually been established. That takes real time and real research. And it means we can't push out content as fast as some channels covering this exact story. What it does mean is you can trust what you're hearing. Right now, our subscriber count is a lot smaller than the number of people actually watching these videos. And that only changes one way. If you're finding value in how carefully we're handling this story, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and join the community following this case with us. It costs you nothing, and it helps this kind of careful reporting actually reach more people. Thank you. Now, back to Horn Island. To understand what makes this case so difficult to pin down, you have to understand the sheer scale of what was happening on Horn Island that afternoon. According to Warren Hudson, one of the friends who was on that trip and who has since spoken publicly, both to the New York Post and in an on-camera interview, this was in a small, tight circle of 4 or 5 kids on one boat. It was closer to 20 to 30 people, spread across 3 separate boats, all traveling out together as one loose group. Hudson has estimated the total crowd on that stretch of the island that day at somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 people. Boats line up in rows along the shoreline for as far as the eye could see. It's worth sitting with that number for a moment, because so much of the public conversation around this case has pictured Nolan alone with 3 or 4 people. The reality, if Hudson's account holds up, is a beach packed with strangers, acquaintances, and old friends from half a dozen different corners of Nolan's life, all overlapping at once. According to GPS records later obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the boat carrying Nolan's immediate group left its dock at approximately 9:56 in the morning. It arrived at Horn Island a little over an hour later at 11:14 a.m. Neither of those timestamps raises a single question on their own. It's an ordinary holiday morning departure to an island the same group had visited before. The last confirmed sighting of Nolan alive places him on Horn Island's western tip around 3 o'clock that afternoon. He was wearing blue swim trunks and sunglasses, no shirt, according to photographs taken earlier that day. Sometime in that hour, according to multiple accounts, Nolan struck up a conversation with a young woman on the beach. Her name, according to reporting that has since become public, is Katie. At around that same hour, according to dispatch audio later obtained through a public records request, someone aboard the group's boat placed a call for towing assistance. The recording is short, but it's one of the very few pieces of evidence in this entire case that exists completely independently of anyone's memory of that day. We're sinking. Can y'all please come? And is everybody on board and in good health otherwise? Yeah, everybody's on board. The boat's bilge pump, the mechanical system that keeps water from accumulating inside the hull, had failed. The vessel was taking on water. That detail matters enormously, and it's worth being precise about why. For weeks, the explanation for why the group left the island rested almost entirely on one public account. A statement from Jackson County Chancery Court Judge Ashley Cole, whose son Warren had been on the boat with Nolan that day. In a public post, she said the group left around 4:30 because of mechanical failure, that her son last saw Nolan around 3 o'clock, and that Nolan made his own decision to stay behind, planning to catch a ride back to the mainland later with a different group of friends he'd met on the island that day. When that statement first went public, none of it could be independently verified. It was one family's account, relayed secondhand, and it deserved to be treated exactly that way at the time, not dismissed outright, and not accepted as settled fact either. Some of it has since gained real, independent corroboration. The dispatch audio, recorded in real time, hours before anyone on Earth knew Nolan would go missing, confirms that the mechanical failure genuinely happened. Nobody invents a boat emergency in advance of a disappearance that hasn't occurred yet. That specific piece of the account holds up under scrutiny, and any honest telling of this case has to say so plainly. The GPS data tells a closely aligned story from a completely different angle. According to records, the boat left Horn Island at 4:31 p.m., nearly matching Judge Cole's account almost to the minute. It returned to its original departure dock at approximately 5:44 p.m., after apparently being towed for several miles at reduced speed before picking back up to normal cruising speed less than an hour later. From there, the GPS shows the boat traveling into Fort Bayou, back to the dock a second time, and eventually to a boat launch, from where it appears to have been towed overland by vehicle to the residence of the boat's owner in Biloxi. So here's what is confirmed, and it's important to separate this clearly from what is not. The boat had a genuine, documented mechanical failure that afternoon. It left the island without Nolan at approximately 4:31 p.m. It returned to a mainland dock a little over an hour later. What is not confirmed is why Nolan wasn't aboard when it left.
A $100,000 reward is now being offered for answers after the mysterious death of Mississippi teenager Nolan Wells. His mother speaking at the 18-year-old's funeral yesterday.
We will miss everything about him, from his quiet nature to the corny jokes. His gentle smile, a piece of our hearts will always be missing.
Wells was last seen alive on a July 4th boat trip with friends to an island off the Mississippi coast. They returned without him, saying he stayed behind after meeting a girl. His body was found nearby 2 days later. His father yesterday fighting back tears, remembering the college wide receiver who dreamed of one day playing in the NFL.
I nicknamed you Mr. Cool Hands because it seemed like you was catching a touchdown every game.
Delivering the eulogy, the Reverend Al Sharpton, announcing a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction.
He was not on that island by himself. Somebody saw something and knows something.
Then a text from actor Tyler Perry, matching that reward, bringing it to $100,000. Investigators say they believe Wells drowned and say they do not suspect foul play. But an official cause of death has not been released. The sheriff says more than 60 witnesses have now been interviewed, and Wells's phone is being analyzed.
Whether he stayed by his own choice, as his friends and their families have said, or whether the circumstances were more complicated than that. And what remains almost entirely unaccounted for on any side of the story is what actually happened on that beach during the roughly 90 minutes between the 3 o'clock distress call and the 4:31 departure, a window that, as of this recording, nobody has publicly walked through in detail. That 90-minute gap is, in a very real sense, where this entire investigation still lives. When the boat pulled back into the dock and Nolan wasn't on it, nobody called Christine right away. Not by every available account, because anyone was trying to hide anything, but because this same group had made the same trip before, and an evening without word from an 18-year-old on a holiday weekend wasn't yet, in anyone's mind, a crisis. That changed just after 11 o'clock that night, when Christine's phone rang. It wasn't Nolan. It was one of his friends. She said publicly more than once that this was the moment something inside her shifted, that a call like that, from a friend and not from her son, simply didn't happen under ordinary circumstances. Around that same hour, according to public reporting, one of Nolan's friends placed a call of his own to the United States Coast Guard to report Nolan missing. The Coast Guard's response that night, as later reported, was that the situation as described didn't meet the threshold for immediate deployment. No cutter went out. No aircraft went up. It was the kind of call that gets logged and closed within minutes. The kind that, in the moment, means very little. That decision, made in the very first hour anyone official was told something was wrong, would later become one of the quieter but more consequential details in this entire timeline, because it meant real hours passed before any organized search response began. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office did not formally request Coast Guard assistance until around noon the next day, a gap of roughly 13 hours between the first call for help and an official, multi-agency search actually getting underway. Nobody has offered a detailed public explanation for that specific gap, and we're not going to fill it in with speculation. It's simply part of the record. Christine spent the rest of that night trying to track her son down herself before turning fully to law enforcement. When she finally did, she ran into a problem nobody had warned her about. Exactly which agency held jurisdiction over a missing person case originating on a stretch of federal barrier island wasn't immediately clear to anyone she spoke with. She's described a frustrating back and forth between departments before the Jackson County Sheriff's Office finally agreed to open a formal report. Later that night, she and Elmore met a deputy in a McDonald's parking lot and laid out everything they knew. By morning, Elmore couldn't wait on process. He took out his own boat on July 5th and searched near Horn Island himself, a father combing open water while, in parallel, an organized search effort stood itself up on shore. A command post was established at a boat launch in Ocean Springs, and the search grew quickly to include the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, the United States Coast Guard, and the United Cajun Navy, a volunteer search and rescue organization with a long history of stepping in on Gulf Coast searches like this one. 4 full days, that search covered land and water around Horn Island with no result. Then, early on the morning of Monday, July 6th, at approximately 8:45 a.m., a National Park Service ranger spotted a body in the water along the island's northwestern shore. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter confirmed it matched the description investigators had circulated for Nolan Wells. The search for Nolan Wells was over. The search for what actually happened to him on that island was only just beginning. In the earliest hours after Nolan's body was recovered, Sheriff John Ledbetter's office made a statement that would go on to shape almost everything that followed in this case, for better and for worse. There is no information that we have right now that would lead us to believe that a crime has occurred, the sheriff said. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lynn added that there were no immediate signs of physical injury on the body. To a lot of people watching the story unfold in real time, that statement read like a case being quietly waved through. A small county wrapping up a tragic accident before the family had even finished processing what had happened, let alone before a full autopsy, let alone before toxicology results that officials themselves said could take weeks. It became, almost instantly, the single sentence that lit this entire case on fire across social media. It's worth being precise here about what that statement actually meant and what it didn't. Investigators later clarified that the phrase was describing an initial surface-level observation at the scene, that there were no obvious, visible signs of trauma on the body when it was found. It was not a finding. It was not a conclusion about cause or manner of death. It was an early observation offered to a public that had almost no other information to hold on to, and it was widely misread as something far more final than it actually was. That distinction matters, and it's one of the very first examples in this case of a real, measurable gap between what officials actually said and what the public heard. But the family's frustration with that early statement wasn't really about semantics. It was about timing. Christine has said publicly that it was not even an hour after her son's body had been removed from the beach that the sheriff's office was already using language that sounded, to her, like the door was closing on an investigation that had barely opened. Please take this case as if this is your child. She has said she asked investigators directly. They promised her they would. But the early framing had already done its damage, and trust between this family and local law enforcement never fully recovered from that first day. Within days of the recovery, Nolan's family stood in front of cameras for the first time. They were not quiet, and they were not passive. They demanded a full and transparent investigation. Because even in those first raw days of grief, something about the pace of the early statements didn't sit right with them. Their son was a trained, healthy athlete on a swim-adjacent team background, a strong swimmer by every account from people who knew him. And 2 other people had been in that water area with him that day, according to the family's understanding, and neither one, in the family's telling, had called them directly with news of what had happened. The family brought in civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who would go on to become one of the most consistent public voices in this case. Crump has framed the family's demand plainly and repeatedly. Not a specific conclusion, not an accusation against any named person, but fair, thorough, and transparent investigation, conducted with the same intensity any family would expect if the roles were reversed. If a story like this one is the kind of case you want to keep following closely, this next part matters. We're going to keep tracking every single update in the Nolan Wells case, the toxicology results, the grand jury process, the joint phone inspection, every bit of it, the moment it's actually confirmed. Right now, we've got a lot more people watching these videos than we have people subscribed. And honestly, that gap is the only thing standing between this channel growing and just staying where it is. If this kind of careful, fact-first coverage is worth something to you, take 2 seconds and hit subscribe, and consider turning on notifications so you don't miss the next update the moment it drops. We genuinely appreciate every one of you who does. Now, let's get into the phone. If there's one single piece of evidence in this entire case that keeps pulling every conversation back to itself, it's Nolan's cell phone. When Nolan was reported missing, his phone was not with him. It surfaced in the possession of one of his friends. According to Christine, she and her sister tracked the device themselves using a family location sharing app and located it at a friend's residence, rather than being handed it directly by anyone connected to that day. Here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and where it's important to slow down rather than rush to a conclusion. Christine has said that when she and her sister finally accessed the phone, both of Nolan's Snapchat accounts were completely empty. No saved photos, no saved videos, even though, by her account, Nolan reliably documented gatherings exactly like this one, and even though that kind of content should typically still have been retrievable within the app's normal 24-hour window. Some text messages appear to be missing as well. None of that, on its own, proves that anyone tampered with anything. People clear their phones for all kinds of ordinary reasons that have nothing to do with a crime. But it's worth understanding what deletion on a modern phone actually means before drawing any conclusion in either direction. Deleted data is not automatically unrecoverable. Forensic extraction can often retrieve information off a device long after someone believes it's permanently gone. Carrier-side records exist independently of whatever survives on the device itself. One of Nolan's friends, Warren Hudson, has offered a very different and genuinely plausible explanation. Speaking to reporters, he said it's normal practice for the group to leave their phones on the boat while they're in the water, to protect them from salt water and splashing, and that when he and the others got in the water that day, Nolan put his own phone on the boat's dashboard alongside roughly 15 other phones belonging to other people in the group. As for the missing Snapchat content specifically, another account from a member of the United Cajun Navy search team has pointed to something simpler still. Cell signal on Horn Island is notoriously unreliable, and Snapchat doesn't upload content without a signal. If Nolan took photos that day and simply couldn't get a connection to post them, the app would show nothing from that day at all, with no deletion required. Both of those explanations are worth taking seriously. Neither one has been proven. That's the honest state of this particular piece of evidence right now. There's a second layer to the phone story that has generated just as much conversation. 2 separate location tracking tools. Snapchat's own map feature and the Life 360 app reportedly show conflicting information about where Nolan's phone actually was in the hours after he went missing. One of those tools updates automatically in real time. The other only updates when someone actively opens the app. That technical difference alone can explain a meaningful amount of the discrepancy Christine has described, according to a legal analyst who has discussed this case publicly. Location data on consumer apps like these depends heavily on network signal, and a large group of people gathered closely together, all using their phones at once, can genuinely interfere with each other's signal strength in ways that produce inconsistent or delayed readings. That same analyst made an important, careful point that applies to nearly every piece of digital evidence discussed in this case. Everything currently known about the phone's contents comes from a family looking at the device themselves and describing what they believe is missing. That is not the same thing as an actual forensic data extraction conducted by trained digital examiners, capable of determining conclusively whether anything was deleted, and if so, when and by whom. Until that kind of extraction happens, what exists right now is a family's honest, troubling observation, not confirmed digital forensic evidence. That is precisely why the single most significant procedural development in this entire case, so far, may be the one that gets the least dramatic headline treatment. Following a meeting between Nolan's parents and Jackson County District Attorney Angela Myers McElrath on July 15th, both sides agreed to a mutual, simultaneous inspection of Nolan's phone. The family's own forensic experts and law enforcement's experts examined the device together at the same time, seeing the exact same data pulled the exact same way, specifically so that neither side can later dispute how the other's process was handled. Legal analysts who discussed this case publicly have described that arrangement as genuinely unusual, the kind of joint access to a piece of digital evidence that typically doesn't happen without significant, sustained public and legal pressure. It reflects two things at once: a real trust deficit between this family and the initial law enforcement response, and a genuine, documented effort by the district attorney's office to try to rebuild some of that trust before this case moves any further. As of the most recent reporting available, that inspection has been agreed to. A confirmed date and confirmed results have not yet been made public. Two separate pieces of viral evidence dominated the earliest weeks of public conversation around this case. Both of them, on closer examination, turned out to be considerably shakier than they first appeared. Understanding exactly how and why matters, because it tells you something important about how a case like this one can outrun the facts long before the facts are actually ready. The first was a short video, filmed from a boat, panning across the water toward a crowded stretch of Horn Island. Somewhere in that footage, according to the family's legal team, a voice could be heard demanding a phone back. Something close to, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" Attorney Ben Crump told multiple outlets in the case's early days that his team believed that voice belonged to Nolan. For a large portion of the public watching this case unfold online, that claim was treated almost instantly as confirmed fact. It became one of the single most repeated and most dissected details of the entire story. It has since been directly disputed. A friend named Tristan Shepard came forward publicly to ABC News and said the voice on that video is his own, from an entirely separate, unrelated altercation with someone else that day, and that Nolan isn't even shown in the footage. He's described being physically calmed down and helped off a boat during that altercation, and said Nolan was nearby in the water, out of frame, at the time. At a later press conference, a reporter pressed Crump directly on whether that quote could actually be confirmed as Nolan's voice. His answer was noticeably more careful than it had been earlier in the case. The original claim, he said, came from one witness. Since then, another witness has come forward disputing it. Other witnesses have described entirely separate altercations that day. His team, he said, now has audio experts working to try to determine, if possible, whose voice is actually captured on the recording. And as of that press conference, the question remained unresolved. Crump also said something worth repeating plainly, because it is a genuine and meaningful correction on the record. Going forward, his team will be more careful to frame single witness claims explicitly as claims. This is what a witness told us, rather than presenting them as confirmed fact. That is a real on-record walkback of one of the most emotionally loaded details in this entire case, and it deserves to be remembered every time that original clip resurfaces online as though it were never revisited. The second piece of viral evidence was a photograph. showing Nolan at what appeared to be a pool party, which spread rapidly online alongside claims that he'd been seen alive well after the 4th of July, that he'd somehow returned from the island, gotten into an altercation elsewhere, and that his body had been placed back in the water afterward. Rolling Stone investigated the photo's actual origin using image metadata obtained independently, combined with an account from Nolan's friend Tristan Shepard, who identified the people in the photo himself, including Nolan. The photo was taken on June 27th, 8 days before the 4th of July, and before Nolan ever boarded that boat to Horn Island. The party in the image took place in Pass Christian, Mississippi, and had nothing to do with the day he disappeared. According to Shepard, the photo was simply uploaded as part of a casual photo dump of recent memories on July 5th. The upload date and the date the photo was actually taken were two entirely different things, a distinction that got lost almost immediately once the image started spreading. Crump himself has acknowledged that his own team reposted that image without authenticating it, specifically to ask the public whether anyone recognized it, not as confirmed evidence, and has said his team's social media accounts consistently label reposts as reposts for exactly this reason. Both of these examples matter for the same underlying reason. A claim that spreads across the internet in a matter of hours can be repeated, screenshotted, and treated as gospel by thousands of people long before anyone with actual authority to verify it has had the chance to do so. In a case already this emotionally charged, that gap between what's confirmed and what merely feels true is exactly where fabricated or mistaken claims tend to travel fastest, and it's exactly the kind of gap this documentary is trying not to fall into itself. Of every unresolved thread in this case, the one that has generated the most public argument is also, in a strange way, the one that turns out to be the least mysterious once you actually slow down and look at what was said by whom and how directly. Katie is the young woman Nolan spoke within his last confirmed minutes on that beach. For weeks, everything attributed to her arrived through intermediaries. First through a family friend relaying what she'd heard secondhand, then through Katie's own mother and sister posting on Facebook to correct rumors that had spiraled out of control online. Each of those accounts was filtered, understandably, through someone else's memory of what Katie had said, rather than coming directly from the one person who actually has first-hand knowledge of Nolan's final confirmed words. That changed when Katie met with Christine directly, face-to-face, without anyone standing between them. According to Christine, Katie has been consistent from the very beginning. She and Nolan met that day, spent time together, and eventually parted ways. Katie then got back on a boat with her own friends, separate from Nolan's group. She assumed, based on their conversation, that Nolan was heading back to rejoin his own friend's boat. Here is the detail that actually matters most, and the one that got flattened almost immediately once this story went viral. Katie never actually saw Nolan get on that boat. She assumed it based on what he told her. She did not personally witness him rejoining his friends. That distinction is genuinely important. It means Katie's account isn't a direct eyewitness contradiction of the friend group's story, in the sense of her having seen one thing while they claim another. It's closer to this. Nolan told her his intention. Whether he actually followed through on that intention before whatever happened next is something nobody, not Katie, not the friends, not the family, can currently confirm firsthand. Both an assumption based on a genuine conversation and a claim from the friend group that he chose to stay behind can technically be true at different moments. If something changed the time between that conversation and whatever came after it. A clean, direct contradiction, one witness says this, another says the opposite, makes for a far more compelling story than an honest assumption relayed secondhand. But Katie's actual position, as relayed by Christine, is more measured than the loudest version of this story online has ever allowed it to be. She is not claiming she watched Nolan walk away from her and board a specific boat. She's saying he told her a plan, and she had every reason at the time to believe he'd follow through on it. This reframes, at least somewhat, what actually still needs to be explained. If Katie's account is accurate, the real mystery isn't whether Nolan wanted to leave. It's what happened in the gap between him stating that intention and whatever came next, a gap that, as of this recording, nobody has been able to account for weeks. The exact reason the FBI was involved in this case had only ever been explained in fragments. A line here, a comment there, enough to fuel speculation, but never enough to actually settle it. That changed when the FBI's Jackson Field office released a complete, on-the-record public statement. It says that while the FBI has assisted with certain aspects of the investigation, using federal tools and partnerships, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office is leading and will continue to lead this investigation. It describes a long-standing working relationship between the two agencies built over years of cooperating on complex cases. And it says the FBI has been supporting Jackson County from day one in the effort to gather information and find answers for the Wells family and the broader community. Critically, the statement specifies exactly where the Bureau's efforts have actually been focused: on interstate threats received by individuals connected to this matter. That detail changes the shape of the FBI's role in this story considerably. Federal involvement here isn't about escalating Nolan's death into a federal homicide matter. It's about protecting people connected to this case from threats serious enough to cross state lines, which is precisely the kind of thing that triggers federal jurisdiction, regardless of how large or small the underlying case happens to be. Sheriff Ledbetter has separately confirmed the FBI is also assisting with digital evidence review and has pointed out that federal involvement isn't unusual here at all, given that Horn Island itself sits on federal land. The statement does not specify exactly what those threats said or precisely who received them, but on the record, in their own words, at least 2 people connected to this case have confirmed being threatened. Jackson County Chancery Judge Ashley Cole, the stepmother Warren, one of the friends who was on the boat with Nolan that day, has said publicly that she and her family have received a wave of death threats since this case drew national attention. Tristan Shepard has said the same about himself and others in the friend group. It is worth pausing on what that actually means. In the middle of an active, painful, unresolved investigation into their own son's death, Nolan's parents have said they received anonymous hate mail targeting their own legal team, arriving in the middle of planning their 18-year-old son's funeral. At the very same time, other families connected to the same case, families who have not been charged with anything, are also reporting threats serious enough to draw the involvement of federal agents. Both things are true, and both are genuinely awful, and neither one cancels the other out. Whoever is sending threats to anyone connected to this case, regardless of what they believe happened to Nolan, is committing a serious crime. Grief, suspicion, and public pressure do not grant anyone permission to threaten a teenager, a parent, a sitting judge, or anyone else. And every single threat like this makes it measurably less likely that anyone still holding real information about that afternoon will feel safe enough to come forward with it. There is a broader pattern worth naming plainly here, because it applies to every single name attached to this case, on every side of it, without exception. In the middle of the same investigation, artificial intelligence-generated fake videos depicting Christine herself have reportedly circulated online. Fabricated footage of a grieving mother, built with AI, spreading while she is simultaneously planning her son's funeral, sitting through press conference after press conference in front of national cameras, and fighting for a police report she is legally entitled to under state law. Ben Crump's message on this specific point has been simple, and it's worth carrying to the rest of the story. Nobody's life should be threatened in the pursuit of the truth. Nobody should be presumed guilty of anything before actual evidence exists. There's a broader consequence of all of this that's easy to overlook in the middle of a story this emotionally charged. Every single witness in this case, every friend, every family member, every young person who happened to be on that island or near it that day, is watching all of this unfold in real time, in public, with their own name potentially one headline away from becoming the center of it, if coming forward or simply being named publicly, carries the risk of threats serious enough to draw federal attention. That create a real chilling effect on anyone who might otherwise be willing to speak up with information that could actually help this investigation move forward. Protecting people from that kind of retaliation isn't just a matter of basic decency. It is directly connected to whether this case can ever get the full cooperation it actually needs to be resolved. It would be dishonest to tell this story without acknowledging how large it grew and why. Within days of Nolan's disappearance, This case had already spread far beyond a single stretch of Mississippi coastline, not because a network assigned it, not because a producer somewhere greenlit the coverage, because ordinary people kept sharing it, kept returning to it, kept asking the same handful of questions in 100 different ways, across every platform where people gather to talk about the things that will not leave them alone. Part of what drew that attention in the very first days was a photograph that circulated before any official statement had even been made. In the images that spread early, one detail stood out immediately to a lot of people who looked closely. Nolan appears to be the only black teenager in a group of mostly white friends. On its own, that detail proves nothing about what happened on that island, and outlets and officials covering this case have said exactly that publicly from the start. But paired with an early statement ruling out foul play before toxicology, results existed to support it, and the fact that Nolan's phone ended up in someone else's possession entirely, that detail did not stay quietly in the background of the conversation for very long. This case also reopened a set of much older, unresolved conversations for a lot of people watching it, particularly across the South, about who gets believed quickly and who has to fight to be believed at all, about how fast a case can get treated as settled when the people asking hardest questions aren't in the room. For families of color watching this unfold from far outside Mississippi, this case landed somewhere genuinely personal for many of them, in a way that shaped a great deal of the online conversation long before any actual evidence had arrived to support or contradict it. Running underneath all of that, there has also been real, consistent restraint from multiple directions that deserves acknowledgement. Reporters covering this case day after day have been careful to say the same thing in nearly identical language, more than once. Nobody covering this story credibly, including this documentary, has claimed to know exactly what happened on that island. What has been said consistently by journalists and by the family's own attorneys standing in front of cameras is that too many basic, answerable questions remain open, a timeline that does not fully add up, results that have not been released, a phone that had not for weeks been jointly examined by anyone, for anyone on any side of this conversation, to honestly claim they already have the full picture. That is the tension sitting at the center of this entire case right now. On one side, a public that has already formed a strong feeling, shaped by a photograph, a delay, and a statement made too soon. On the other, an investigation that has not yet produced a single finding anyone can point to and call final. Not resolved, not dismissed, held uncomfortably in the space between what people believe happened on that island and what has actually been proven. And that space is exactly where the story remains as of the most recent reporting available. We want to pause here for a moment, because this next part of the story shifts into some genuinely heavy medical and legal territory, and we want you with us for it. If you've made it this far into this video, you clearly care about getting the story right, and that's exactly the kind of audience this channel is built for. We put a lot of hours into cross-referencing every claim you're hearing tonight against multiple outlets before it ever makes it into one of these scripts. And the only real cost of supporting that work is 30 seconds of your time. If you haven't already, tap subscribe right now. And if this update is teaching you something louder, faster coverage of this case left out, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. It genuinely helps this channel keep reaching the people who want the careful version of this story instead of the loudest one. Now, the autopsy. At the center of nearly every unresolved question in this case sits one piece of pending evidence: the actual cause and manner of Nolan's death. The state autopsy was carried out on July 7th at the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office. Investigators have said there is currently no indication of drug or alcohol involvement, though officials have been clear that this reading is preliminary. A full, official cause and manner of death has still not been released because the medical examiner's office is waiting on toxicology results. Results officials themselves have said could take a couple of weeks or considerably longer, depending on lab capacity. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lynn has confirmed directly to reporters that the swimsuit recovered on the body matched the one Nolan had been photographed wearing earlier that same day. That's, so far, the single fact in this entire timeline that both the family and the official investigation agree on without qualification. What they do not agree on is what that fact means for how he ended up in the water in the first place. Crump has said publicly more than once that Nolan was a genuine athlete in peak physical condition, a strong swimmer, and that at a crowded holiday beach with potentially thousands of people scattered along it, it isn't the kind of place a strong swimmer simply disappears from unnoticed. Coroner Lynn has offered a different frame, describing the current on that end of Horn Island as genuinely strong, and noting that the specific stretch of the Barrier Islands has a documented history of drownings over the years, independent of this particular case. A representative of the United Cajun Navy, the volunteer organization that helped in the search, has added real, first-hand context that neither side's framing fully captures on its own. That specific stretch of water off the island's northwestern tip is notoriously dangerous, so much so that people who work it regularly have their own nickname for it. They call it the washing machine, because the current rolls and churns in that area in a way that can pull a person under quickly and unpredictably. Depth in that exact area, he said, can shift from 2 or 3 feet to as much as 20 feet within just a couple of steps, an extraordinarily fast transition. The kind that can catch even a strong, confident swimmer off guard, especially if they aren't intimately familiar with that specific patch of coastline. And, he's added, not every person who drowns is heard screaming or seen struggling visibly. Depending on the current, the depth, and how quickly someone becomes overwhelmed, a drowning can happen quietly, close to shore, without anyone nearby realizing what's happening in time to help. That last point connects to something worth understanding more broadly, separate entirely from the specific case. People who study drowning have long noted that real drownings very rarely resemble the dramatic splashing and shouting most of us picture, largely because of how these scenes are typically depicted in film and television. In reality, a drowning person's body is often physiologically unable to call out or wave for help at all, because the body prioritizes the basic mechanics of trying to breathe over any other voluntary movement. That means an actual drowning can look, from even a short distance, deceptively calm, almost unremarkable, right up until it's too late for anyone nearby to intervene. That reality doesn't prove what happened to Nolan, but it does mean the absence of a visible, chaotic struggle on a crowded beach isn't, on its own, evidence that something other than drowning must have occurred, because the family said from very early on that they had no confidence the state's process alone would answer their questions. Nolan's body was flown to Washington, D.C. for a fully independent second autopsy, a process entirely separate from Mississippi's official examination, funded in part by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, and performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell's credentials are worth sitting with for a moment, because they speak directly to a concern this family has raised from nearly the beginning of this case. He is a board-certified forensic pathologist with 2 decades of experience, currently serving as president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest professional organization representing black physicians in the United States. He previously served as chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C. for 7 years, and later as interim deputy mayor for public safety and justice in that same city. Christine and Elmore have said repeatedly that they want an examiner with absolutely no ties to Mississippi law enforcement whatsoever, someone whose findings couldn't be dismissed as biased toward or influenced by local officials. A sitting national leader of the country's oldest professional association of black physicians, brought in from entirely outside the state, funded by an outside party rather than any government agency, fits that specific requirement about as directly as it's possible to fit it. Mitchell's exam took place on July 10th, 6 days after Nolan disappeared and 4 days after his body was recovered, meaning it happened after the state's own autopsy, not before it and not instead of it. The preliminary findings from that second independent autopsy were announced publicly for the first time on July 19th at the NAACP's National Convention in Chicago in front of a packed, standing-room-only crowd. Attorney Ben Crump stood beside Nolan's parents and read directly from Dr. Mitchell's written report. NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson stood with them, lending the full institutional weight of the organization to what was about to be said. The central conclusion, read aloud from the report, cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. That word, undetermined, is doing a great deal of work in this case, and it deserves to be unpacked carefully rather than treated as either a dead end or a smoking gun. The report described no fractures, no deep tissue injuries beyond one single area discussed below, no lacerations of the skin, no fractures of the underlying skull anywhere else on the body. Across most of Nolan's remains, the independent examination did not find obvious signs of blunt force trauma. That negative finding matters almost as much as the positive one that follows, because a body that suffered severe, sustained physical assault would typically show a much broader range of injuries than a single localized area of concern. The relative absence of those broader injuries doesn't rule out something happening to Nolan, but it does narrow the range of plausible scenarios considerably, away from a prolonged violent assault, and towards something more specific, more localized, or potentially consistent with an accidental drowning. Here is the finding that has driven almost every headline out of this update. Dr. Mitchell identified a focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissue on the back of Nolan's head, over the occipital bone, the bone at the base of the skull. Its size, according to the report, 12 inches by 8 inches. The cause of that discoloration is, in Mitchell's own written words, unknown. It is genuinely important to understand exactly what that finding is, and what it is not. This is not a bruise in the ordinary, visible sense, something you'd see just by looking at skin. This is deep soft tissue discoloration, found during the internal portion of the exam, without any corresponding skull fracture or laceration to the skin above it. That combination is unusual enough that a pathologist would want a clear explanation for it, which is exactly why Mitchell flagged it explicitly in his preliminary report rather than treating it as an incidental detail. But an unexplained finding is not the same thing as a confirmed cause. Mitchell's own report states plainly that the origin of the specific discoloration could reflect an impact. It could also reflect something related to the physiological process of drowning itself. It could reflect decomposition or the effects of handling and transporting the body across state lines for a second exam performed days after first. The report does not claim to know which of those it is. It documents that the discoloration exists and that its cause is currently unexplained. Crump was direct about a second, and arguably more significant, limitation the second exam ran into. Before the independent autopsy ever took place, Mississippi's own medical examiner's office had already retained certain internal structures from Nolan's neck, specifically his trachea, his laryngeal cartilage, his thyroid horn, and his hyoid bone, for its own further evaluation. That retention is, by every account including Dr. Mitchell's own, a standard, common practice in forensic pathology, not something unique or improper to the specific case. The issue isn't that the retention itself was inappropriate. It's that the sequencing of two separate examinations meant the independent pathologist arrived after those specific structures were no longer available for him to examine directly himself. That detail carries real weight, because the hyoid bone specifically is one of the structures forensic pathologists look at most closely when trying to determine whether strangulation played any role in a death. A fractured hyoid bone is a well-known indicator in exactly that kind of examination, with that structure already retained by the state before Mitchell's exam happened. He was simply unable to independently check for that himself. That is precisely why, in Crump's own framing, this pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor to or cause of Nolan's death. Not because Mitchell found evidence of strangulation, but because he was never given the opportunity to check for it using the same structures the state already had control over. The report also confirms that no toxicology results were included in this second examination at all, and that the state's own toxicology results, meant to accompany the official autopsy, have also still not come back. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lynn has confirmed directly that the state's autopsy report remains unfinished for that exact reason. This means both investigative tracks, the state's and the family's independent one, are currently stalled at the exact same bottleneck, waiting on the exact same category of testing, through entirely separate labs run by entirely separate examiners. That's worth noting plainly, because it undercuts any suggestion that one side is deliberately dragging its feet while the other moves quickly. Both processes appear to be waiting on a step neither side can simply speed up on demand. There's a reason that particular wait matters so much medically, and it's worth explaining in plain terms. Drowning produces pulmonary edema, fluid buildup in the lungs, caused by the body's oxygen deprivation shutting down normal function. A drug overdose produces the exact same kind of pulmonary edema through a very similar physiological pathway. Looking at the lungs alone cannot reliably distinguish between the two. That's why drowning in forensic pathology is often described as a diagnosis of exclusion. You don't confirm it directly. You rule out the alternatives first, especially an overdose, and only then does drowning become the remaining supported explanation. Toxicology is a tool that actually does that ruling out, and it can take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to come back. To be extremely clear, because this point matters, there's been no suggestion from any source, official or otherwise, that Nolan used drugs that day or that drugs played any role whatsoever in what happened to him. This detail is being explained purely because it's part of the standard medical framework examiners have to work through, and it's the honest reason toxicology takes as long as it does, not because there's any specific evidence pointing toward it in Nolan's case. The report closes with a list of the specific, outstanding questions Dr. Mitchell says still need to be answered before a real conclusion can be reached. What circumstances led Nolan into the water in the first place? What position his body was in when it was found? Whether water was present in his airway? Whether there's any evidence of injury to the front of his neck? Whether there's evidence of intracranial hemorrhaging? What was found in his stomach contents? And finally, what the completed toxicology screening ultimately shows. The report's final classification, stated plainly in writing on July 19, 2026, cause and manner of death undetermined, pending investigation. There is one more piece of first-hand testimony worth including here, separate from the medical findings, because it speaks directly to a question Crump has raised repeatedly in public. If Nolan was struggling in the water on a beach that may have held thousands of people that day, why did nobody reportedly notice or step in to help? A representative of the United Cajun Navy was asked directly about a theory that had circulated online, that Nolan's body may have been moved deliberately from somewhere else and placed back in the water to make his death look like an ordinary drowning. He did not dismiss the question outright, but said plainly that he personally does not believe that happened. At the same time, he made a concrete practical offer. His organization has cadaver dogs, trained specifically to detect trace evidence of blood even after an attempt has been made to clean away, and he offered those dogs directly to search the boat involved in this case, referencing a prior case in which his organization's dogs played a documented, instrumental role in helping locate evidence that led to an arrest in an unrelated homicide. Whether that offer has been accepted or whether the boat has already been examined through some other forensic method entirely, has not been publicly confirmed as of this recording. That is worth flagging as its own open question, separate from everything else covered here, a specific, credible offer of forensic assistance, made publicly by an organization with an actual track record, sitting seemingly unaddressed, is exactly the kind of detail worth continuing to watch closely as this case moves forward. Following the announcement, Attorney Ben Crump laid out two specific, forward-looking requests. First, that Dr. Mitchell be given direct access to the state's own findings, including the completed toxicology report, once it's finished. Second, that Mitchell be included personally when this case is eventually presented to a Mississippi grand jury, so that the independent pathologist's perspective is part of that process, rather than a grand jury hearing only from the state's own examiner. Whether either of those requests is ultimately granted remains, as of this recording, an open question. There is a human dimension to this case that risks getting lost underneath the forensic terminology, the GPS coordinates, and the legal procedure, and it deserves real space of its own. A licensed psychotherapist who has discussed this case publicly used a specific clinical term to describe what Christine is living through: ambiguous loss. One of the most difficult forms of grief there is, precisely because it lacks resolution. In her framing, a parent's nervous system cannot begin to fully process a loss like this one when the actual story of what happened remains genuinely unknown. Christine's own description of her last real memory of her son has become something close to a defining image of this entire case, repeated across nearly every interview and press conference she's given. He came into the kitchen the night before the trip. She made the family salmon for dinner. He was heading out to spend the night with friends ahead of the holiday. Hey, Mom, I'm about to go. I love you. A hug, a kiss, and then he left. That's the whole memory. No timeline, no contradiction, no phone, no boat, just an entirely ordinary goodbye that turned out, without her knowing it in that moment, to be the last one she would ever get. In most cases of loss, even sudden and tragic ones, there's eventually a settled narrative to attach the grief to: a car accident, an illness, a specific, understood cause. That narrative, painful as it is, gives grief somewhere concrete to land, a story the mind can eventually begin to integrate over time. Ambiguous loss withholds exactly that. Without a settled explanation, the mind keeps circling back to the same unanswered questions, unable to complete the process that ordinary grief eventually allows. Grief needs a story to actually attach itself to, that same psychotherapist has said. Until this family has the truth, that grief has nowhere real to land. In her framing, transparency in this investigation isn't only a legal or procedural issue. It's a mental health necessity for a family that cannot begin to properly grieve until they actually understand what happened to their son. That reframes something worth carrying through the rest of how this case gets covered and discussed anywhere by anyone. Every procedural delay, every unanswered question, every piece of missing forensic data isn't simply a matter of legal process moving at its own pace. For Christine and Elmore specifically, each one of those delays represents an extension of exactly the kind of unresolved, suspended grief described above. That doesn't mean investigators should rush or cut corners chasing a faster resolution. Thoroughness matters enormously here too. But the human cost of this investigation's pace is real. It is ongoing, and it deserves to be acknowledged as its own significant part of this story, separate from the legal stakes alone. Before we move into where this case stands legally right now, we want to say thank you to everyone who stayed with us this far into tonight's update. Stories like this one only stay in front of the people who can actually still do something about them when enough people keep sharing and following along. And that's really the whole reason we ask. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, now's a good moment. And if you know someone who's been following this case but missing the details, this is a good video to send them. Every share, every subscribe, every comment tells the algorithm that stories like Nolan's deserve to keep being told carefully instead of just loudly. We appreciate every one of you for that. Now, let's talk about what a grand jury referral in this case actually means, because it has been widely misunderstood. Following the July 15th meeting between Nolan's parents and Jackson County District Attorney Angela Myers McElrath, Attorney Ben Crump confirmed the case will eventually be presented to a grand jury once the underlying investigation by the sheriff's office is fully complete. It's worth being precise here, because this is exactly the kind of announcement that gets distorted online within hours of being made. A grand jury referral for an unnatural or suspicious death is described by local attorneys as standard procedure in Jackson County. It does not by itself mean criminal charges are coming. The district attorney's office has stated directly that authorities have not indicated at this stage that this is being treated as a criminal investigation. A grand jury is a panel of ordinary citizens, typically somewhere between 15 and 25 people in this jurisdiction, who review evidence that prosecutors choose to present to them and decide whether there's enough to support formally moving forward with charges. It is not a trial. There's no defense presentation in the way you'd see in a courtroom. It's prosecutors presenting evidence and a panel deciding on its own whether probable cause exists. That referral hasn't been received as unambiguous good news by everyone following this case. Former Mississippi Judge Carlos Moore has publicly raised his own concerns about District Attorney McElrath's office, pointing to what he describes as its history in a previous, unrelated case involving a fatal police shooting, where he says overwhelming evidence still failed to produce an indictment. He's argued that a grand jury referral alone shouldn't automatically be mistaken for progress, and has said he intends to keep watching the specific case closely to make sure it doesn't quietly stall the way he believes that earlier case did. A different attorney, discussing the case publicly, has offered a more measured read, explaining that a grand jury referral is genuinely standard, routine procedure in this county for any death considered unnatural or suspicious, not by itself proof that foul play has been confirmed or even strongly suspected. Both of those perspectives are worth holding at the same time. The referral can be standard procedure, and this specific district attorney's office can still deserve close, continued attention. The real test isn't the referral itself. It's what actually happens once a grand jury eventually receives whatever evidence this investigation ultimately produces. If this matter does go before a grand jury, legal analysts have noted that the range of potential outcomes is genuinely broad and doesn't necessarily point toward a homicide charge specifically. It could touch on obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact, or other offenses tied to how the immediate aftermath of Nolan's disappearance was handled. Not necessarily proof of who caused the death, if anyone did. On the specific question of a homicide-related charge, the honest answer, according to attorneys who discuss this case publicly, is that it remains genuinely difficult to assess from the outside because the cause of death itself has not been determined. Whether physical evidence supports blunt force trauma, whether someone was in the water under coercion versus voluntarily, or whether an ordinary drowning occurred, is a forensic question that depends entirely on what the pending autopsies ultimately show, not on witness testimony alone. There is also a specific, concrete, checkable procedural grievance connected to this meeting, separate from every other competing claim in this case. Under Mississippi law, crime victims, which, under most state victims' rights statutes, extends to immediate family members in a death case, are entitled to receive an incident report and certain baseline case information within a specific window, cited by the family's attorney as 72 hours. That window had long passed by the time of this meeting, and the family still had not received that report. Christine added a detail worth including in full. She said the last time anyone from the sheriff's department had actually communicated with the family before this meeting was the previous Tuesday, and that contact wasn't even initiated by the sheriff's office. She was the one who sent a text message asking for an update on her own son's death investigation. Following the meeting, the district attorney's office agreed to take over as the family's primary point of contact going forward, through a dedicated victim advocate. Christine has said she appreciated that the office acknowledged responsibility for the communication gap that had existed, though it's worth noting plainly that this acknowledgement and the plan to fix it came only after the family's legal team raised the issue directly in that meeting, not proactively from law enforcement beforehand. On Monday, July 20th, 2026, Nolan Wells was laid to rest at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs. The visitation ran from 9 to 11 that morning, with the service beginning immediately after. Christine made a deliberate choice about how she wanted that day to feel, and she said so directly beforehand. "We want to celebrate Nolan," she said. "He would not want us sitting around crying. So what we're going to do is kind of have a party to celebrate him." That celebration of life was held afterward at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, open not just to family, but to former teammates from every level of Nolan's football career, coaches, classmates, and notably to media as well. She let the cameras in deliberately, saying she wanted the world watching. There's a detail worth including here that's easy to miss. The Mississippi Coast Coliseum and Convention Center's own commission had actually voted, without objection, to offer its venue for service. The family ultimately chose Centerpoint Church instead, and the Coliseum's executive director responded with real grace, releasing a statement saying they supported the family's decision and remained committed to standing with them and the broader community through this difficult time. That exchange, a public venue offering itself, being turned down and responding with warmth rather than any hint of offense, says something about the broader community response to this case that's easy to overlook amid everything else. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated at the family's request. Filmmaker Tyler Perry covered the entire cost of the funeral. Colin Kaepernick's contribution had already covered the independent autopsy. In his eulogy, Sharpton reached back into a history Mississippi has spent generations trying to leave behind. He invoked the names Emmett Till and Medgar Evers, placing Nolan's name directly beside him in the room, whether or not the family had specifically asked for that comparison. He was careful in that same eulogy to add an important qualifier. We cannot say it was racist, but we cannot say it was not racist. So let's not judge either way until all the evidence is in. In the middle of that same service, Sharpton announced a $50,000 reward live for anyone with information leading to a real answer in Nolan's case. Before the words had even finished settling over the room, Tyler Perry, who had already quietly paid for the funeral itself, matched the pledge in real time. $50,000 became $100,000, announced out loud inside the service. In the days that followed, that figure grew again, with former NFL player Terrell Owens adding his own contribution, bringing the total reward to $125,000. Near the close of the funeral, Ben Crump led the congregation in a chant that began low near the front pews and rose row by row until it carried out through the open doors and into the parking lot beyond them. Nolan's life mattered, repeated again and again by a room that had gathered to bury a teenager and left instead demanding, together, out loud, that his death not be allowed to quietly disappear into an unfinished file somewhere in a records office. 2 days before that funeral, standing in front of a wall of cameras, Christine had made a request that stands apart from almost everything else said about this case. She was not asking reporters, investigators, or the state of Mississippi for a particular outcome. She asked simply that anyone planning to demonstrate, even on the day of the funeral, do so peacefully, adding that her son would never have wanted any kind of conflict or disorder connected to his name. Consider what that request represents. A mother, days away from burying her son, chose to use one of her limited public statements not to demand accountability or name a suspect, but to ask strangers she will never meet to exercise restraint at his funeral. There is a fear buried inside that request that she never said out loud directly, a fear that the day meant to honor her son could instead become something else entirely, something loud and combustible, something that would make his funeral about everyone except him. That she felt the need to say this at all shows how far this case had already traveled beyond the young man at its center. Somewhere between a 4th of July boat trip and a Monday morning service, Nolan Wells stopped belonging only to his family. He became, to some, a symbol, to others, a flashpoint, and to his mother, a name now carrying a weight she never wanted and now feels responsible for managing, even while she is still herself grieving. At the close of the later press conference, following the release of Dr. Mitchell's preliminary autopsy findings, NAACP President Derek Johnson didn't limit his comments to the medical findings themselves. "We are accusing them," he said, of local Mississippi officials, of being derelict in their duties to follow up and ensure that regardless of what actually happened, there was a proper investigation conducted. It's worth noting the precision of that specific wording. Johnson wasn't claiming, on behalf of the NAACP, to already know that Nolan was the victim of foul play. He was arguing something narrower, but still serious, that the investigation itself, independent of whatever the eventual conclusion turns out to be, should have already met a higher standard of thoroughness and transparency than it had at that point demonstrated. That a meaningful distinction, separating an accusation about process from an accusation about outcome, and it's one worth keeping in mind as public figures continue weighing in on this case going forward. That criticism wasn't only rhetorical. The NAACP formally passed a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, explicitly including the Department of Justice, to conduct a complete, transparent review of exactly how Nolan ended up left behind on that island and what happened to him afterward. For most of this case, the friends who were on that boat with Nolan have said very little publicly, largely on the advice of counsel, and largely, according to their own accounts, out of fear following the threats already discussed in this documentary. One of them, Warren Hudson, eventually broke that silence, first in a brief interview with the New York Post, and later in a longer, on-camera conversation with a political commentator. In the New York Post interview, Hudson pushed back directly on any suggestion that he had done something to harm his longtime friend, and on the framing of race as a factor in the case. "There's no facts out, just a lot of rumors," he said. "That's just how the internet is today. That's really it. It's horrible." In the longer, on-camera interview that followed, Hudson described a friendship that went back to elementary school. "I could describe Nolan in a million ways," he said. "Nolan was not just a best friend of mine, but he was a brother. I grew up through elementary, middle school, high school, and even our freshman year of college. Nolan was like a brother to me. No one lit up every room he walked in. He always had a smile on his face." He walked through the day itself in detail, describing a friend group of 20 to 30 people spread across 3 boats, not the small, isolated circle much of the public conversation online had assumed. He estimated the total crowd on that stretch of Horn Island that day at somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 people, describing boats lined up 3 rows deep along the shoreline. He said he had several separate conversations with Nolan throughout the day, that Nolan was drinking, as most people there were, and that Nolan seemed completely normal and in good spirits every single time they spoke. "Nolan seemed completely fine every time I talked to him," Hudson said. "We had just regular conversations. Nolan was making me laugh." It's worth being clear about how we're treating Hudson's account, and every other account from anyone connected to this case who has not been charged with any crime. Nobody in this story has been named a suspect. Nobody has been charged. Under those circumstances, Hudson's account deserves to be presented fairly, on the same terms as every other account in this case, as one person's version of events offered publicly and on the record, not as a confession, and not as proof of anything beyond what he's actually said. The same standard applies equally to every other name in this story. Separately, Judge Ashley Cole, Warren's stepmother, addressed the case publicly on behalf of her family in the days after Nolan's body was found, stating that no one in her family was trying, in any way, to impede the investigation, and that Warren had cooperated fully with the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. Because she is a sitting judge, her public statement about an active investigation involving her own family have drawn separate scrutiny of their own. Judicial complaints have reportedly been filed with the Mississippi Commission on Judicial Performance regarding her public comments. That review process, by its nature, is confidential unless and until it results in a formal recommendation to the Mississippi Supreme Court, and as of this recording, no such recommendation has been made public. We are including this detail for the same reason we've included every other procedural thread in this documentary. Not to draw a conclusion about it, but because it's part of the honest, full record of everything currently swirling around this case. Here is where this case actually stands as of this recording, laid out as plainly and as honestly as we can manage. Confirmed facts first, genuinely unresolved questions after, with nothing blurred between the two. Confirmed. The boat's full documented movement, from a 9:56 a.m. departure to an 11:14 a.m. arrival at Horn Island. A 3 o'clock distress call, independently corroborating a genuine mechanical failure aboard the boat. A 4:31 p.m. departure from the island that closely matches the earliest public account of that afternoon. A 5:44 p.m. return to the original dock. Formal identification of Nolan's body through dental records. A case now formally headed toward presentation before a grand jury once the sheriff's office investigation concludes. A joint simultaneous forensic inspection of Nolan's phone, agreed to by both the family's investigators and law enforcement. Confirmed cooperation with investigators from several individuals connected to the boat and the day's events. The FBI has confirmed limited role supporting Jackson County, and specifically addressing interstate threats made against people connected to this case. Katie's direct, in-person account, Christine, an honest assumption based on a real conversation, not a first-hand claim about what happened afterward. A confirmed procedural gap in which the family did not receive their legally entitled incident report within a required window. A 12 by 8 inch area of unexplained discoloration in the deep soft tissue on the back of Nolan's head, documented in the independent autopsy, with no accompanying skull fracture or skin laceration. a written statement from an independent board-certified forensic pathologist that he cannot rule out foul play, specifically injury to the neck, a statement made explicitly because his examination was incomplete, not because he found direct evidence of it. Unresolved. Exactly why Nolan wasn't aboard the boat when it left the island, whether by his own choice, as one account holds, or under circumstances that remain more complicated. What happened during the roughly 90-minute window between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and the boat's eventual departure, whose voice is actually captured on the widely circulated viral video, still under review by audio experts. What content, if any, was actually deleted from Nolan's phone, and by whom, pending the joint forensic examination that has been agreed to but not yet completed. What both the states and the independent autopsy will ultimately conclude about cause and manner of death. Once toxicology results from both sides finally arrive, the specific content of the threats the FBI has confirmed occurred, but has not detailed, and exactly who received them. No cause of death has been officially confirmed as of this recording. No individual has been named a suspect. No charges have been filed against anyone in connection with Nolan Wells' death. It's worth restating plainly, because it's the single most important distinction in this entire case, and the one most likely to get lost the moment this documentary ends and the comment section begins. An unexplained finding is not the same thing as a confirmed cause. A pathologist saying he cannot rule out foul play is meaningfully different from a pathologist saying he has found evidence of foul play. Both of those statements are true right now about this case at the same time, and both deserve to be reported and repeated accurately, without collapsing one into the other. This case has already suffered from exactly that kind of collapse before, with the video, with the pool party photo, with early characterizations of secondhand witness statements treated as settled fact. Whatever comes next in this investigation deserves better than that same treatment. Regardless of how dramatic a number like 12 inches by 8 inches might sound completely on its own, strip away the GPS data, the grand jury procedure, the digital forensics, and the competing autopsy reports, and here's what this case actually is. Underneath all of it, a mother is still waking up every single morning to the same question she's been asking since the night his friends came home without him, not as an accusation aimed at any one person, but as a plain, unbearable question any parent in her position would ask. What happened to my son? The toxicology results are still pending. The full state autopsy is still pending. The joint phone inspection has been agreed to, but a completed timeline for it has not been made public. The formal grand jury process has not yet begun in earnest. When any of those things actually change, not before, and not based on whatever spreads fastest online in the meantime, that's when this case will genuinely move forward. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He was a wide receiver who celebrated other people's wins as loudly as his own. He was a student teachers remembered for making sure nobody in the room ever felt overlooked. He was a son his parents are still, weeks later, trying to find a way to talk about in the past tense. He was supposed to report back to campus on July 6th to start preseason training. He was supposed to have an entire football season ahead of him and an entire life after that. Instead, his name is now attached to a grand jury referral, 2 unfinished autopsy reports, an FBI statement about interstate threats, and a reward fund that has grown to $125,000 for information his own family still doesn't have. We are not going to pretend to know things we don't know. We are not going to name a guilty party this case hasn't named. What we can tell you, honestly, is this. Every piece of real evidence that has surfaced in this case so far, the GPS data, the tow call audio, Katie's direct account, and now this autopsy finding, has done the same 2 things at once. It has added real, concrete substance to what was previously speculation, while simultaneously opening up new, more specific questions that didn't exist before. That's not a flaw in how this case has unfolded. That's simply what a genuine, careful investigation actually looks like from the outside. Incremental, occasionally frustrating, and only rarely delivering the kind of single, dramatic answer true crime coverage sometimes promises. What this case has delivered instead is something slower, and in its own way, more honest, a steadily growing body of real documented evidence, still being assembled into a complete picture nobody on any side of the story has been able to fully see yet. We will stay on this story exactly as long as it takes. The moment the toxicology results land, the moment that phone inspection actually happens, the moment a grand jury reaches any decision at all, we will bring you the facts as we actually get them confirmed, and not a moment before. There's a version of this story that would have been easier to tell. It would have picked a side in the first 5 minutes and spent the rest of its runtime proving that side right, cutting every inconvenient detail that complicated the narrative, treating a rumor with the same weight as a documented finding, because the rumor made for better television. That version of this story already exists in a dozen different forms, scattered across every platform where this case has been discussed since the 4th of July. We didn't want to make another one of those. What we wanted to make instead was something closer to what this family has actually been asking for from the very beginning. Not a verdict handed down from a comment section, but a fair, thorough, honest accounting of everything that is actually known and everything that genuinely isn't yet. Christine and Elmore have said themselves more than once in more than one press conference. They are not asking anyone to convict a specific person. They are asking for the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be. And they are asking for it to be pursued with the same seriousness any family would expect if the roles in this story were reversed. Somewhere in Ocean Springs tonight, that graduation photo is still sitting on a hallway table. A football jersey is still hanging in a closet it was supposed to be worn out of on a Monday morning that never came. And somewhere in a laboratory neither Mississippi nor Washington, D.C. can rush on demand, the answer this family has been waiting on since July 4th is still being written one test at a time. Rest easy, Nolan. If this documentary gave you the clearest picture of this case you found anywhere, that's exactly what we set out to build tonight. And it's the only kind of true crime coverage we're interested in making. We're going to keep following the Nolan Wells case for as long as it takes to get real answers. The toxicology reports, the phone inspection, the grand jury, all of it. And we want you here for every single update. If you're not subscribed yet, this is genuinely the moment to fix that. Because the next update on this case could land any day now. And we'd rather you hear from a channel that took the time to get it right the first time. Drop a comment below and tell us which unresolved question in tonight's video you think matters most, because we read every single one, and it shapes exactly what we dig into next. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and for caring enough about the truth to sit with a story that still doesn't have an ending. We'll see you in the next one.